I felt it before I understood it. The exact moment when a thought turns into a responsibility. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was the smallest shift inside me, like a weight settling in the chest before you know you're carrying it. A sentence formed in my mouth and stopped there, pressed behind my teeth as if my own body knew it didn't belong in the air. I remember how ordinary everything looked around me, and how wrong that felt. The light didn't change. No one turned their head. Paper moved from one hand to another. A chair scraped softly. Breath went in and out, steady, unbothered. The world kept its calm shape, even as something in me started to fracture. It wasn't fear the way people describe fear later. Sharp, clear, heroic in its warning. It was thinner than that, more humiliating. It was the fear of being noticed, the fear of being the one to interrupt, the fear of putting myself into a sentence that could not be pulled back. Because once a warning leaves you, it belongs to everyone. It becomes a thing other people can weigh, dismiss, twist into an accusation. It can be called panic. It can be called insolence. It can be called anything except what it is. And I knew, with a certainty I didn't want, that if I spoke, they would look at me in a way I could never correct. There was a rhythm to the room, words spoken in the same tone they were always spoken, decisions arriving with the same tired certainty. Even before anything happened, you could feel the machinery of agreement clicking into place. A nod here, a short confirmation there, a silence that didn't mean uncertainty, only obedience. I watched mouths move. I watched hands point, tap, fold, release. I watched men pretend they were not tired, pretend they were not afraid, pretend they had never been wrong before. Not because they believed it, but because the pretending was part of the uniform. It kept everything smooth. It kept things moving, and I felt something else underneath my fear. An ugly, stubborn clarity, a simple recognition that made my stomach tighten. This isn't right. Not in a philosophical way, not in a moral way. In the plain, mechanical way, a hinge is wrong, or a bridge beam is wrong. A wrongness you can feel in your bones even if you can't prove it with words. A wrongness that doesn't ask permission to exist. I had reasons ready. They arrived instantly, like trained animals. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe they already considered it. Maybe it's not my place. Maybe it's too late to change anything. Maybe the cost of speaking will be worse than the cost of silence. Each reason came with an image. Faces turning toward me. The pause that would follow. The shift in the air. The cold patience of someone higher than me waiting for me to explain myself. I could see the shape of their attention before it even happened, and my throat tightened, as if the future had already reached in and taken hold. I tried to tell myself I wasn't certain enough. That certainty was for men who issued decisions, not for men who stood close enough to hear them. That the safest thing was to keep my doubts private, locked away where they could not cause trouble. But the thought wouldn't stay locked. It pressed against me, heavy and persistent, like a hand on the back of my neck. The longer I held it, the more it felt like something living. I became aware of my own body in a way I never had before. The heat in my palms, the shallow pull of breath, the small delay between what I wanted to do and what I actually did. I could feel the word I meant to say sitting in my mouth like metal. A warning doesn't always come as a shout. Sometimes it comes as a quiet knowledge you hate yourself for having. And what made it worse was that nothing was forcing me to stay silent. Not in a visible way. No hand over my mouth. No direct threat spoken. No weapon turned toward me. Just the invisible weight of how things were done. The way you learn, quickly, that peace in a room can be more dangerous than noise. The way you learn that asking a question can brand you more deeply than making a mistake. I told myself I would find a better moment. A private moment, a safer moment. I told myself I would speak when it mattered most. But even as I said that to myself, I felt time sliding forward, smooth and unstoppable, carrying the decision with it. The sentence in my mouth dissolved into nothing. My lips stayed closed. My face stayed neutral. My eyes stayed where they were supposed to stay. And in that stillness, without anyone noticing, I chose the silence first. They taught us early that the safest man is the one who blends into the work. Not because he is better, but because he is predictable. Predictable men don't slow anything down. They don't invite questions that have nowhere to go. They don't force anyone to explain themselves. They carry out what is put in front of them, and when they speak, it is only to confirm that they understood. That was the air we lived in, thick with routine and permission. Everything had its place. Every voice had a ceiling. I was close enough to hear decisions as they were shaped, close enough to see how easily a plan could harden into fact. But closeness is not power. Closeness is often just exposure. You see more, and you are expected to react less. The day moved the way days always moved. The same narrow hours broken by the same signals, the same exchange of papers, the same murmurs of messages passed along. Words were carried like cargo, handled quickly, without emotion, because emotion made them heavier. When a message came down, it arrived already sealed in certainty. The only acceptable response was to treat it as normal. Even the men who gave the messages didn't act as if they owned them. They acted like conduits. A decision wasn't presented as an opinion. It was presented as the natural conclusion of something larger than any single mind. Orders didn't need explaining because explanation implied the possibility of refusal. And refusal was the one thing we all pretended did not exist. You learned the hierarchy the way you learn a language, by watching what caused a room to tighten. A certain kind of pause when someone entered. A quiet adjustment in posture, the way a sentence could be cut in half simply by a glance. Nobody announced these rules. Nobody had to. They were enforced by embarrassment and consequence, by the invisible threat of being labeled difficult, unreliable, dangerous. In wartime, those labels didn't just follow you, they could swallow you whole. I had seen men disappear from the center of things without ever leaving. One day they were present, and the next they were somewhere else, pushed into the edges, given work that didn't matter. Their names stopped being said, their opinions stopped being requested. They became shadows that moved when told to move. The message was simple. You can survive here without being brave. All you have to do is stay in your place. My place was never at the table where decisions were made. It was beside it, near enough to hear the tone that meant a decision had been reached, near enough to watch the faces that pretended they weren't relieved to be following someone else's certainty. I handled what I was given. I listened. I carried information from one set of hands to another. I watched maps being studied and rewritten, watched pencil lines become confident, watched tired eyes pretend clarity. I watched men lean over something and call it necessary, as if necessity was a shield against doubt. There were rules about what you could say, and when. There were rules about how many questions were acceptable before your questions stopped being considered questions and started being considered resistance. And then there were the unspoken rules, which were heavier than all of it. If you questioned too sharply, you weren't offering help. You were implying incompetence. You were implying weakness in the structure that held everyone together. In a world built on obedience, implication could be a kind of attack. So people learned to speak in a softened way. They learned to swallow edges off their thoughts. They learned to say, just to clarify, when what they meant was, this is wrong. They learned to say, I might be mistaken, when what they meant was, I'm certain. They learned to bury warnings under politeness and let them die there. I learned it too, not because I agreed, but because agreement was safer than honesty. And safety was treated like a virtue. It wasn't only fear of punishment. It was fear of becoming a problem, fear of being the one who made others uncomfortable. In a place where everyone was already carrying too much, discomfort was considered selfish. There was a particular kind of quiet that lived in those spaces. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of containment, the quiet that came from people managing themselves, adjusting their faces, holding their words until they were harmless. At times, it almost felt like discipline. It looked like professionalism. Men who had learned to keep their voices steady no matter what was happening beyond the walls. Men who could talk about lives as if they were numbers, talk about hours as if they were expendable, and you could mistake that steadiness for strength. But I started to understand it as something else, a way of avoiding responsibility for what you knew. Because if you never said the warning out loud, you never had to own it. You never had to carry the shame of being right too early or wrong too loudly. I was not immune to that temptation. I lived inside it. I told myself I was only there to observe and carry out what came down, that my job was to execute, not to interpret, that the people above me had information I didn't, that they had weighed risks I couldn't see, that their confidence was earned. Those thoughts weren't comforting. They were convenient, and convenience, I learned, is how silence survives. There were moments when someone lower would speak, a brief hesitation, a mild concern, and you could feel the room react as if something fragile had been dropped. The response was rarely cruel in an obvious way. It didn't need to be. A raised eyebrow, a small sigh, a correction delivered with patience that wasn't patience at all. Then the room would move on, and the man who spoke would learn what it cost. Not blood, not a beating. Something quieter. The sudden awareness that he had made himself visible. Visibility was dangerous. In those days, nothing frightened me more than the idea of being seen as a man who didn't understand his place. A man who thought his thoughts deserved the same air as the thoughts of others. A man who could disrupt the rhythm that kept everything moving. That fear didn't come from cowardice alone. It came from experience. From watching how quickly the system defended itself against anything that resembled doubt. So I did what everyone did. I trained my face. I kept my voice measured. I nodded when others nodded. I wrote things down as if writing them made them more true. I learned to move through the days without showing what I noticed. And yet, beneath all that practice, something kept growing in me. Quiet, persistent, unwelcome. A sense that there would come a moment when routine wouldn't protect me. A moment when the only difference between being a participant and being a witness would be a single sentence. I didn't know when it would come. I didn't know exactly what shape it would take. I only knew that the structure around me was designed to make that sentence feel impossible, and I could already feel myself preparing not to say it. The thought began returning to me in fragments, never all at once. Derived in the pauses between tasks, in the half-seconds when nothing was required of me, and my mind slipped its leash. I would be listening to someone speak and realize I wasn't hearing the words anymore, only the shape of what they were building. I would be copying figures, relaying instructions, standing still while others talked, and somewhere beneath it all, the same pressure would surface. This will not hold. I didn't say it to myself in words. It came as sensation first. A tightening behind the eyes, a dull ache in the chest, the awareness that something was being carried forward because no one wanted to stop and feel its weight. I tried to reason with it. You're imagining patterns that aren't there. You don't have the full picture. If it were truly wrong, someone else would have noticed. These were not lies exactly. They were habits of thought, polished by necessity. In a system like ours, certainty was dangerous, unless it belonged to the right person. Doubt was acceptable only when it stayed private. There were moments, small, almost invisible moments, when I felt closest to speaking. A sentence would leave someone else's mouth slightly misshapen, as if they had forced it to sound confident. A detail would be brushed aside too quickly. A question would be answered before it was fully asked. In those moments, the room would feel briefly unbalanced, like a table with one short leg. I would inhale. I would feel my jaw tighten. And then I would imagine the sound of my own voice entering that space. Not shouting, not accusing, just stating what I saw. And immediately, the consequences would assemble themselves in my mind with terrifying clarity. I imagined the silence that would follow, how it would stretch just long enough to mark me as the cause. I imagined eyes turning toward me, not with curiosity but with calculation. I imagined someone higher pausing, not because they were considering my words, but because they were deciding how to handle me. Would they ask me to explain? Or worse, would they ask me to justify myself? Justification requires confidence. Confidence requires rank. I had neither. I imagined my words being repeated later, stripped of their caution, retold as something sharper than I intended. I imagined being remembered not as careful but as disruptive, not as concerned, but as unsure. In wartime, uncertainty was treated like a contagious illness, and I imagined the look on the faces of the men beside me, the quick, subtle withdrawal. No one wants to stand too close to someone who might be seen as a problem. Proximity itself becomes a risk. These images came so fast and so vividly that they felt less like imagination and more like memory from the future. There were other rationalizations too, quieter ones. You're tired. Fatigue makes everything feel worse than it is. You've seen errors before that never became disasters. If you speak and you're wrong, you won't just embarrass yourself. You'll weaken confidence when confidence is all anyone has left. That last thought stayed with me longer than the others. Confidence was currency. It was traded daily, passed from hand to hand, often without question. To interrupt it felt almost immoral, as if doubt itself could do harm. I began to tell myself that silence was a form of discipline. That holding back was part of the job. That restraint was proof I understood how things worked. But restraint, I learned, has a way of disguising itself as virtue. There were times I would rehearse the warning silently, shaping it into something smaller, something safer. I would soften it, sand it down, remove anything that could sound like certainty. By the time I was done, it barely resembled what I felt. And even then, I didn't speak, because even a softened warning still carried a question beneath it. And questions, once asked, have a way of refusing to disappear. I noticed how often I waited for someone else to say what I wouldn't. Each time a new voice entered the room, some part of me leaned toward it, hopeful. Maybe this one would ask. Maybe this one would hesitate out loud. Maybe responsibility would shift away from me. But it never did. Everyone was waiting for someone else. That realization frightened me more than anything else. That the silence wasn't accidental. It was collective. It was maintained by people who all sensed something, but not strongly enough to risk standing alone with it. And I was one of them. At night, when the noise receded and I was left with my own thoughts, the warning returned in a different form. Not as fear, but as accusation. I would replay the day and isolate the moments when I could have spoken. I would examine them as if they were objects, turning them over, measuring their weight. There, that pause. There, that glance. There, that moment when no one was speaking, and the space was briefly open. Each time I had chosen to let the moment close. I told myself that timing mattered, that speaking too early could be as dangerous as speaking too late, that waiting was a form of intelligence. But waiting has no endpoint unless you give it one, and I never did. As the days moved forward, the pressure didn't lessen. It sharpened. The sense of inevitability grew stronger, not because anyone said so, but because no one questioned it. Plans that should have been fragile were treated as settled. Preparations continued with a confidence that felt increasingly performative. I began to notice small signs of strain in others, hesitations quickly masked, jokes that fell flat, expressions that hardened too fast. No one spoke about doubt, but doubt left fingerprints everywhere. Each time I noticed, I felt the warning rise again, and each time I swallowed it. Not because I believed silence was right, but because I believed speaking would cost me something I didn't know how to lose. My position, my belonging, my ability to remain invisible. In a world where survival depended on fitting into the shape assigned to you, invisibility felt like protection. So I stayed still. I let the thought circle inside me, growing heavier, more precise, more unbearable. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether I should speak. I began asking whether I could live with myself if I did. The answer never came, only the silence did. The decision arrived without ceremony. It was spoken in the same tone as everything else, measured, efficient, untroubled. No one raised their voice. No one leaned forward with urgency. It was framed as a conclusion already reached somewhere beyond the room, merely passing through us on its way to becoming reality. I felt the moment approach before it landed, a tightening in the air, a subtle shift in posture, the sense that whatever space still existed for doubt was narrowing fast. Someone summarized, someone else confirmed. A final phrase was spoken, one that carried weight not because of its content, but because of what followed it. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for input, only compliance. That was the moment. I knew it with a clarity that left no room for excuse. Not suspicion, not unease, knowledge. The warning rose in me fully formed, no longer vague or emotional, but precise. I understood what was being overlooked, what assumption was being treated as fact, what fragile thing was being trusted to hold. And I understood that if I spoke now, it would change the room. Not the outcome, not necessarily, but the room. Everything in me moved toward that possibility. My body reacted before my thoughts could interfere. My breath caught, my shoulders tensed. I felt heat rush into my face, then drain away, leaving a cold steadiness behind. I could feel the word pressing forward, heavier than before. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't careful. It didn't come dressed in politeness or uncertainty. It was simple, almost blunt. This will fail. I didn't think about how to phrase it. I didn't think about who would respond. For a brief instant, all the calculations disappeared. There was only the knowledge and the opening where it could be placed. And then I felt something else, just as strong, the awareness of my own insignificance. The room was already moving past the moment. Pens were being lifted. Chairs shifted slightly. Someone reached for the next document. The machinery had accepted the decision and was beginning to carry it forward. To interrupt it now would not be a gentle act. It would be a disruption, a refusal to let the process remain smooth. I imagined the faces again. Not hostile, not angry, just tired. Tired of obstacles, tired of uncertainty, tired of anything that threatened to slow them down. I imagined myself speaking and felt the weight of their attention settle on me like a physical force. I imagined explaining, and then explaining again. I imagined my words being reduced to a footnote, a complication, a delay, and worse than being dismissed, I imagined being indulged. A nod, a reassurance, a promise to take it into account, the decision proceeding unchanged, only now with my name attached to a doubt that would accomplish nothing except mark me as someone who didn't know when to stop. That thought hollowed me out, because if I spoke and nothing changed, I would still have to live with what followed. Only then I would have lost the protection of silence without gaining the relief of having prevented anything. My mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. I could feel the muscles in my throat lock, as if my body had decided for me. The warning retreated just enough to make room for something colder and more practical. This is not your role. This is already decided. You will only make things worse. The final confirmation was given, a simple acknowledgement delivered without emphasis, the kind of phrase that ends discussion not by force, but by custom. I lowered my eyes. In that small movement, barely noticeable, the choice was sealed. I stayed quiet. The decision moved on without resistance, smooth and unbroken. The room relaxed in the way it always did once uncertainty was removed. Conversation resumed. Instructions were passed along. The future rearranged itself around a path that could no longer be questioned. No one looked at me. No one needed to. The warning remained where it had always been. Invisible, unspoken, intact. And as the moment slipped behind us, I understood something with a dull, irreversible certainty. Silence, once chosen, does not remain neutral. It becomes an action of its own. The consequences did not arrive all at once. At first, everything appeared to work. Movements followed the expected rhythm. Messages came back in the familiar tone, measured, controlled, deliberately calm. There were no immediate signs that anything had fractured, no alarm strong enough to justify regret. If anything, the early hours carried a dangerous sense of vindication, as if silence had been rewarded. I told myself to pay attention to what was real, not to what I feared. I forced my focus onto routine, onto the small tasks that still belonged to me. Numbers were recorded, reports were delivered. Time advanced in neat, indifferent segments. But beneath that surface, something began to thin. It started with delays that were explained too quickly, with phrases that closed conversations instead of clarifying them, with confirmations that sounded rehearsed, as if repetition alone could strengthen them. I noticed how often people avoided each other's eyes, how questions were redirected instead of answered. The first confirmation came quietly. A piece of information returned altered, not wrong, but incomplete. A gap where certainty should have been. It was subtle enough that no one commented on it openly, subtle enough to be dismissed as error, or noise, or the unavoidable friction of moving parts. I recognized it immediately. It was the shape of the thing I had almost said. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with a slow, sinking heaviness. The knowledge I had carried in silence had begun to surface on its own, stripped of my voice, stripped of warning, arriving too late to be useful. I watched others adjust their posture in small ways. I heard changes in tone that most people would miss. I saw confidence being maintained with increasing effort. The language shifted, less declarative, more conditional, but never enough to invite reversal. No one said, "We were wrong." No one said, "We should stop." The system had already committed itself. To question it now would not be caution, it would be confession. As more information arrived, the pattern grew harder to ignore. What had been assumed stable proved fragile. What had been treated as reliable began to fail in increments. each one just small enough to be endured. I felt the warning inside me change. It was no longer urgent. It was settled. There is a particular kind of despair that comes not from surprise, but from recognition, from watching something unfold exactly as you imagined it would, without any of the relief that comes from being believed. Each confirmation landed like a quiet blow, not sharp enough to knock the breath out of me, but heavy enough to accumulate. I began to carry the weight of outcomes I had no authority over and no right to explain. When others spoke, they spoke around the problem, not into it. They described effects without naming causes. They treated consequences as isolated incidents rather than expressions of a single flaw. And every time, I felt the same sick familiarity. This is it. This is where it begins. There were moments when someone would pause mid-sentence, as if sensing the edge of something too large to articulate. Their voice would falter for a fraction of a second before steadying. Then they would continue, choosing progress over clarity. I recognized that choice. I had made it myself. As time passed, the cost became harder to disguise. Adjustments were made that should not have been necessary. Contingencies were activated that had never been discussed openly. The language of inevitability began to creep in, subtle but unmistakable. Words like unavoidable, words like acceptable, words like given the circumstances. Each one felt like a quiet erasure. I stopped sleeping properly, not because of fear but because of repetition. My mind replayed the same sequence again and again, the moment of decision, the silence that followed, the path locking into place. I would wake with the sense that I had forgotten to do something essential, only to remember that forgetting had been the point. The worst part was not the loss itself, but the normalization of it. After a while, people adjusted. They always do. New routines formed around the damage. New explanations replaced the old assumptions. The extraordinary became ordinary through repetition. I watched this process with a growing sense of unreality. It felt as though the world had shifted slightly out of alignment, and everyone was pretending not to notice. Occasionally, someone would say something that came close, an indirect reference, a half-admission, a careful acknowledgement that things had not gone as expected. In those moments, I would feel a flicker of something like hope, but it never lasted. The conversation would move on. Responsibility would diffuse. The past would be sealed off behind procedural language, and I would remain where I had always been, close enough to know, too small to matter. The confirmation I had feared most arrived without spectacle, not a single event, but an accumulation, a point where denial was no longer sustainable, but reversal was no longer possible. The realization settled over the room not as shock, but as fatigue. This is how it is now. No one looked for a warning then. No one asked who had noticed what, or when. The moment for that kind of honesty had passed with the decision itself. I felt a strange detachment take hold of me. A numbness that wasn't peace but resignation. The knowledge that what followed was no longer shaped by choice, but by momentum. And beneath that numbness, something else hardened. A quiet understanding that the cost of silence does not end when consequences appear. It only becomes permanent. I carried that understanding with me as things continued to unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly, exactly as I had feared. And in every confirmation, I heard the echo of the words I never spoke, growing heavier with each passing hour. Time did not soften it. It changed other things. Faces aged, voices shifted. The language used to describe what happened became more abstract, more distant, as if distance itself could dilute responsibility. But the memory of that moment, the exact instant when I could have spoken and didn't, remained untouched by time. It stayed precise. I learned that memory does not replay events the way they occurred. It replays the point where you lost control of them. For me, that point was not the aftermath, not the losses, not the long explanations that followed. It was the silence, the fraction of a second when my body chose stillness over disruption. That moment returns to me without warning, not as an image, but as a sensation. The locked throat, the restrained breath, the awareness of my own compliance. I feel it while standing in ordinary places, while listening to ordinary sounds. It arrives quietly and leaves nothing changed, except me. I do not tell myself stories about what might have happened if I had spoken. I learned early that speculation is another form of escape. The question was never whether my warning would have been accepted. The question was whether it should have been voiced. And I know the answer to that. What follows silence is not peace. It is continuation. Life moves forward without asking whether you are ready to follow. The world does not pause for regret. It incorporates it. I remained where I was. I did my work. I fulfilled what was expected of me. Outwardly, nothing marked me as different from anyone else who had been present. That was the most unsettling part. Silence leaves no visible scar, but it alters the way you listen. Every decision after that sounded different to me. Every declaration carried an echo. I became acutely aware of pauses, of the spaces where words could exist but did not. I learned to hear absence as clearly as speech. There were times when others spoke later, cautiously, long after it mattered. Their voices were softer then, shaped by consequences rather than prevention. I listened without interruption. I did not correct them. I did not insert myself into their realizations. I had already chosen my role. Guilt did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as familiarity, a constant companion, not dramatic enough to be confronted, not loud enough to demand confession. It settled into my thinking, shaping how I measured my own worth. I stopped believing that silence was neutral. I stopped believing that obedience absolved responsibility. But belief does not undo action. There are nights when I replay that room exactly as it was, the arrangement of bodies, the sound of breath, the calm certainty with which the decision passed through us. I focus on the smallest detail I can remember, as if accuracy might grant permission to forgive myself. It never does, because the detail that matters most is not in the room, it is inside me. The place where a warning lived briefly, fully formed, before being buried. I understand now that some moments do not ask for courage. They ask for presence, for the willingness to accept that speaking may change nothing except who you become afterward. I was present, I understood, and I stayed silent. That is the part that remains. Not the outcome, not the history, not the explanations built afterward. Just the knowledge that there was a moment when a voice was required, and I chose not to give it. And silence, once carried long enough, stops feeling like a choice. It becomes the sound you recognize as your own.